Hello everyone and welcome to the third part of this tutorial series, and in this one we'll continue from where we left off in the previous video. So from the previous video I made mention of the problem of passing this block property via the classes, and I made one little change to the previous code. So previously we had a method over here called build search box, which was a function that returned a widget, but I just separated it into a different stateless widget over here. So it's pretty much the same code, but it's now a stateless widget. So from the previous video, there was something that we did. We passed down the blocks from the movie search down to the custom app bar and down to this widget over here. You can see it over here. This block is being called from the movie search widget down over to the search box, which we passed over here, and we now finally used it in the build method, in the unsubmitted method of the text field widget. So currently I made mention of the problem with this step. So you can see this is just a basic diagram to show how data is being passed down to the search box. So from the movie search, we passed the block down to the custom app bar, from the custom app bar down to the search box. But there's a problem with this, and the problem is that the custom app bar widget doesn't make use of that block. It is only the search bar widget, the search box widget, that makes use of that block. But we had to pass it down from this place to this place, and that is because of the way Flutter is. The nature of nested widgets, you always have to pass down something from the top down to the bottom, and you can see there's a problem with this approach, because imagine in a very big app where you have like the widget tree is about 4, 5, 6, 7 steps down. You'd have to pass the dependency down from the movie search app down to the custom app bar down to your final destination. But we are not going to be using this approach. We are going to be using something called dependency injection, because over here in this search box, you can see this search box depends on what? A block. The search box depends on the block. And just imagine if this search box had so many dependencies, you would have to be adding it from wherever you instantiate them if they are required. I'm not saying that that is actually bad, but for this scenario whereby the custom app bar does not make use of this block, but we just had to pass it down. So we added some implementation detail into this custom app bar, which is not really necessary, because nowhere in this code, there's no place in this code where we actually used this block. We just had to pass it down to search box for it to be consumed. So we need a way to prevent instantiating this block inside this search box class, because we don't want to care about how it's been instantiated. We just want to get the value, we just want to get that dependency and inject it into our app. So I'm not going to talk too much about dependency injection and inversion of control. You can research about the solid principle to get more understanding of what we're actually doing. But for now, I just want you guys to see the problem of passing down the block from this movie search app. We passed it 2 steps down. Meanwhile, we're not going to be using it in this custom app bar widget. So to make use of that, we would want to inject that dependency directly into the search box. And the way to do it is with something called, we'd have to create something called a provider, which can also be called something like an injector. So this provider, we're going to instantiate it or implement it in the movie search screen. Then any other descendants, any other widget that is a descendant of this movie search class is going to have access to those properties. And there are 2 ways to actually do this. The first way would be to use something called inherited widgets. So in Flutter, we have something called inherited widgets, and what they simply do is that if, for instance, this movie search app is an inherited widget and it has a particular property, I could easily share that property with the search box without having to pass down that property to the custom app bar. So that is simply what inherited widgets does. So when you have a parent that is an inherited widget, every children in the subtree would have access to a particular property that it wants to share with them. So now we could simply do that in our in this particular application, and it will work. But the problem with that is that if we come over here, okay, not here, an inherited widget does not have a dispose method, so we won't be able to close the controllers. And I told you something about closing the controllers, that if you don't close the controllers, it could lead to memory leak. So you can see over here in this place, we are actually closing the block. We are actually calling the dispose method of the block. So we can use inherited method and still have this dispose function, but I would not want to implement it that way, simply because I don't want to always manually call this movie block.dispose in every widget that makes use of that block. I would want to handle everything in this provider. So whenever from the provider, we can control that whenever the provider unmounts, we can actually call the dispose method. When I implement it, you get an understanding of what I mean. So one of the disadvantages of using only inherited widgets is that it does not have a dispose method, but we can, the advantage now is that we can easily call the block from this search box as long as the parent is an inherited widget. So now the other way to actually do this would be to use stateful widgets, because stateful widget has access to you have access to the dispose method in a stateful widget. But the downside to that is that if we use a stateful widget, we are going to be making use of oops, I closed it. We're going to be making use of one of the methods of this build context called, I would have to wait for this stuff to come up because I don't remember it. So we have to make use of a method called, yes, ancestor widget of exact type. But the problem of this method is that if we use a stateful widget and we have the provider over here, and this search box wants to call a property that has been shared by this stateful widget, the search box is going to go from here and check. It's going to check the parents, which is the custom app bar. If it does not have that property, or if it is not of that particular type that it needs, that stateful widget type, it's going to go up and check. So now you might say there's nothing wrong with this, and in this simple example, there's nothing wrong with using a stateful widget. But imagine a scenario whereby in your widget tree you have like 10 levels deep in your widget tree. It would always have to be searching for the next parent and be going step by step. But unlike inherited widgets, whereby it just jumps from search box and goes to movie search widget and get the detail. But if you use a stateless widget, you'd have to be going step by step. And in implementing algorithms, there's something called big O. And the big O notation for this is O of n, which means that it is going to, the amount of steps that it is going to take will be equal to the amount of parent widgets it has to go through. So this is quite costly in terms of time. So it's going to take longer time to actually reach its parents, unlike the inherited widget. Now you might be asking, which way are we going to, which one are we going to choose? Are we going to make a stateful widget, which is kind of like a provider, or we're going to make a stateful or an inherited widget, which is also a provider? So and I've talked about the advantage and the disadvantage. So we could go around this by actually combining the two. So we'll combine the power of inherited widgets and we'll also combine the power of a stateful widget. And the advantage is because a stateful widget has the dispose method, and the inherited widgets can just go directly from this search box and head over to the movie search widget. So I believe when I implement this, you'd see what I just explained. So we're going to be combining stateful widgets and inherited widgets. So I'm going to create something called the block provider. So what I intend having is that if I wrap this movie search with a provider, I could easily access this the block from the provider directly. I don't have to be passing it down from movie search to custom app bar to search box. So I'm going to implement a provider widget, which is going to be responsible for doing that. And I believe when I implement this, you'd have a good understanding of what I'm doing. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is creating an inherited widget, because the flow I'm going to be doing is that we'll have a stateful widget, and the inside the stateful widget's build method, it is going to be rendering what? The inherited widget. So I'm going to first create the inherited widgets. And this code, this concept, I got it from one of Didier Bollin's tutorials on how to implement and how to combine the inherited widget with a stateful widget. So block provider inherited, or block provider injector, whichever one you come in, let me check something. Okay, whichever one you want to name it. So I'm going to say it extends inherited widget. And the inherited widget needs you to override one important class method called the updates should notify. And I'm going to return false for now, and I'll explain why I'm returning false. So it just notifies whether whenever the inherited widget changes, whether I should rebuild the children widgets inside it, but I'm going to still come back to this. So for now, I'm just going to say false. So I don't want the children to update whenever the inherited widget changes. So the next thing I'm going to do is that this inherited widget is going to be making use of one property. The property that it would need to be shared would be a block property. And let me create the constructor. So for inherited widgets, it's going to be this, and we'll pass in a key. So I'll call the super. And okay, and the next thing I would also put here would be the child, which is going to be a widget. So this block, and am I doing this correctly? Let me see the error. Can't define a const control non-final field. Okay. So I'm not supposed to declare this widget over here. I'm going to do this.block, and child would be cool. So let me save this. So this is how the inherited widget is going to be. So the property that I would want to share with the subtree of this inherited widget is the block property, because I want, whenever I have the inherited widget over here and it has a block property, I could easily share it with this guy or easily share it with this guy. So if this widget is going to be using you won't have to pass it down to this custom app bar. You can just go from here directly to here. So that is why I'm adding this block property over here. So now the next question would be, okay, because I've not used this, blah, blah, blah. The next question would be, so the reason why I passed in this block and this child is that I want to be able to render, this child is going to be handled by the inherited widget. So the inherited widget class is going to be responsible for rendering whichever child you pass to it. So that's why I'm not like creating the final property here. But the block is what we're going to be getting from this field. And I think, okay, let me add the required, and also add, because these two fields are necessary. So now the next question you're going to be asking is, this inherited widget, you say you need to pass in a block, but the block currently now is of type dynamic. So now I want to create this inherited widget in such a way that I could be able to use it in the friends block, for the friends block, and I can also use it for the movie search block. So I want a kind of like a general way to be able to just create one class, and I could be able to use it in multiple for multiple blocks. So now, if for instance now I just directly say movie search block, it means that this inherited widget would only be responsible for sharing block of the type movie search block. But I don't want to do it this way, so I'm going to be making use of something called generics. So I'm going to pass in a generic type here, and it's going to complain now saying undefined class T. So over here I'm going to put a parameterized literal of type T. So what that simply means is that whenever I'm making use of this inherited widget, I could actually pass in the type. So I could pass in a type of friends list block, or I could pass in a type of movie search block. And this concept of generics, we've talked about it from the previous videos where we talked about the stream controller. So the stream controller makes use of the generics, makes use of generics over here. You can see the stream controller makes use of generics. If there was nothing like generics, I would have to create a stream. I could create something like list string stream controller. I could also create something like movie stream controller, integer stream controller, and that would not be efficient because you would have to be duplicating your code. But with generics here, I could just create one single class and I could pass in the type at runtime. So over here we've passed in type T. So this T is going to be, you can use T, you can use B, you can use whichever name you want to use, but I'm going to use T just to signify type over here. So now the next thing I'm going to do is, this is the generics, this is the inherited widget part. The next part I'm going to do would be the stateful widget part. So I'm going to create a stateful widget called block provider. Block provider. And told you about the reason why we're doing this is because of what? The dispose, because of the dispose because of the dispose method. So it's in this dispose method we can be able to dispose of our block controllers. So cool. So we have the inherited widgets here, and we also have the stateful widgets here. So we have the inherited widgets in order for us to share properties from the parents down to the sub-trees, and we also have the stateful widgets here to help us to dispose our stream controllers. So now how do we combine them? Very simple. So for our stateful widgets, we'd have to return this block provider inherited. So you can call this block provider injector or block injector, whichever one you name it. I may rename it to a block injector because that's what it simply does. So now we have the block provider inherited, and if you notice something here, I'm making it a private class, and the reason I'm doing that is if you head over to this API documentation, it made mention here saying that occasionally, I'll zoom this, occasionally the inherited widget is an implementation detail of another class and is therefore private. So we are going to so you can see this line. So when the inherited widget is an implementation detail of another class, you should make it private. It's not a must, but that's just why I'm doing this. So over here, this inherited widgets, you're not having it directly. The movie search widget is not going to be making use of it directly. It is going to be making use of it via the block provider. So over here, we just made it a private class over here. We just made it a private class over here. Then this block provider that is making use of it would now be able to return it. So now for returning it, I'm going to return the block provider, and remember it needs two properties. The first one is what? It needs the block, and the second one is that it needs a child. So where would I be getting this block and this child? I would be getting it from the block provider widget. So I'm also going to do final widgets child and final block. So before we continue, there's something I want to do. For this block provider inherited, since it's a generic class, I'm going to also add the parameterized literal of t. But now it is going to also complain that t is not a type and it doesn't exist in this class. So I'm going to make this block provider generic. So t, I could come over here and do t. If you don't understand generics, you should try read the docs and you'd see what I'm actually doing over here. So let me create a constructor for this and use the required. I should just copy this. Required, then okay. Is there, okay, there's a problem, that's why. Okay, so over here I could now pass the properties widgets dot block, and over here widgets dot child. So I could now format my code. Cool. So now from the parent over here, the parent accepts two properties, which is the child and the block, and we pass it down to the inherited widget. So whenever we instantiate this provider, it is going to return what? An inherited widget. So I'm combining the powers of both inherited widgets and stateful widget. So now we've used the stateful widget for this. And we said we use the stateful widget because of the dispose method. So over here inside the dispose method, I'm going to do widget.block.dispose. So it's going to be calling the corresponding dispose method of the block we are working with. So it's going to be calling this or calling this. So now let's continue. I'm going to do a recap of everything I'm doing. So if you don't understand, I'll still come back to all this when the code works. So now we have the dispose method and we are calling the dispose method. So whenever this block provider unmounts, it should call the dispose method. So now there's one additional thing we can do. The type of block, okay, I'm going to add it here too. The type of, okay, so cool, it's good that this error happened. So you can see here, the method dispose isn't defined for the class objects. Try correcting the name of the existing method or defining a method name dispose. So now we are calling the method dispose on block. And if you can check here, every block has the dispose method. So friends block has the dispose method over here. Movie search has the dispose method over here. So now there's a problem. How do we call the dispose method of a particular block? And that is very simple. One thing you should notice is that the friends block and the movie search block shares something in common. And what is that thing? It shares this base block. So you can see movie search implements base block and friends block implements what? Base block. And what does base block contain? So you can see over here, the base block is an abstract class which contains this dispose method. So this is kind of like a contract saying that whichever block that implements this interface, although in that there's no interface keyword, but whichever block that implements this interface must implement this dispose method. So now in our provider, since we already have a common interface over here, we could say that whichever type you pass, whichever block you pass should at least extend or implement what? The base block. So now this error should go away. Why? Okay, let me see. Okay, yes, it should go away. So now if this stateful class is extending base block, the private states class is going to should match the signature. So over here, if I have t extends base block, I should come here and do t extends base block, and the error should go. And you can see the error has disappeared. So now, so far, what we've simply done is that we've created an inherited widget over here, which accepts what? A block and a child. And we've also created a stateful widget here, which accepts what? A block and a child. And what the stateful widget does is that it takes up the block, and whenever this block provider is unmounted, it should call the corresponding dispose method. That's one. And the second thing is that it returns an inherited widget. And I've made mention earlier why we are combining an inherited widget and a stateful widget. So cool. So the next thing we have to do here is, whenever you're working with inherited widgets in Flutter, there's a common static method that most of the times you use to share the properties. In this case, the property we are sharing in this inherited widget is the block. So how do we share the block with subtrees? And it's very simple. You're going to be creating a static member of. So this static method is going to just be in charge of doing what? When you call the static method over here, that off method is just going to go to the inherited widget of the type you specified. Like now, if you specify movie search, it's just going to go up to movie search and get the corresponding block. So we have to implement this particular method. So let us do that. And you must have seen this method in stuffs like theme of, that's a very common one, theme of, color from of, and some other method. I think they made mention of it. Okay, you can see here. For example, theme is implemented as a stateless widget that builds a private inherited widget. So we are kind of like replicating what the theme widget actually does. And you can see here, theme of looks for that inherited widget using a particular function of the context, then returns theme data. So when we call block provider of, it's going to look for what? The inherited widgets over here and call the corresponding block. So if I come back to this, to our code over here, I could implement this method, and I'll be implementing it in I'll be implementing it over here. So it's going to be a static method because I want to call it directly for, I don't want to create an instance of block provider to be able to call this method. So I just want to do something like block provider dot off. So that's why I'm creating a static method. So the static method is going to be of type, it's going to return a block. So it's going to be of type T. And the name of the method is going to be off. So it's going to be of type T once more, because T is going to specify the block type, and you would need to pass the what? Build context. Okay, cool. So inside this place, I want to get the type, and over here from this example, you can see they are making use of something called inherit from widget of exact type. But I will not be using this one. I'll be using some other one, and I'll explain why. So if you head over to build context, or before that, let me do something. So now I want to get the type of the widget being passed. Okay, I want to get the type of the widget being passed. So one thing I could do would be to create a static function to actually do that. What should I name it? Static type. You should have a return type of type. I'd say get type. So it has to know the type it wants to get, which is why I'm having this parameterized literal over here of type T. And I want to return T. So what it does is that it takes you specify a type when calling this function, and it is now going to return the type. The reason why we are doing something like this is because we can't directly get if the type is of type block provider with a friend list block, or block provider inherited with a movie search block. So that's why we're creating this function over here to get the type. And when I use it, you'd have a feeling of what I'm actually doing. So I'm going to create final type. So the final type should be, let me call get type. I'll specify the type over here. Am I doing this right? Okay, what type do I want to get? I want to get the block provider inherited type. So I'm going to be doing block provider okay, let me just copy this. That's the type I actually want to get. So whenever I go down the tree, whenever I go from search box, I want to be able to get the corresponding inherited widget that has been injected into this search box. So when I say block provider dot off, then a particular block, it's going to look for the corresponding inherited widgets. So that is why I'm coming over here to do where my block provider inherited of type T. So I want to get the corresponding inherited widgets type. So the corresponding inherited widgets type could be of type friends block or movie search block. So once I get this type, the next thing I would want to do would be to say it should also correspond with this. It should be of type block provider inherited. So I'm going to say context dot, then I'll pass in what's the type. So let me hide this. So now it's saying here a value of type inherited elements can't be assigned to a variable of type block provider widgets, block provider inherited. Okay, so what this simply says is that over here I'm trying to access block provider inherited, but what this guy returns is not a block provider inherited. Instead, is returning an inherited element. So what I could simply do here would be to do dot widget to get the corresponding widget. So now we've gotten the corresponding widget with this dot widget. Over here I said I want to return something of type T, right? So I could simply do return provider. I know this is a bit much to comprehend, but I'll still go back and explain everything I'm doing step by step. So I want to return the provider dot block. So what this simply does, I've explained it over and over again, is whenever you call this method, then whenever we call this method is going to go up the widget tree, but it's not going to be going step by step by step. It's just directly going to go up to the widget tree and return and access the corresponding inherited widgets. So over here, when we call this method, it's just going to do what? Ancestor inherited element for widget of exact type. So which type do we want to access? We want to access the block provider inherited and the type specified inside it. I believe when we implement this code, when we use it in our screen classes, you're going to see how everything works. So I made mention of why I'm using ancestor inherited element for widget of exact type instead of using this particular one. So the reason I'm using this one is simple. So the previous one, as implemented in the Flutter docs, returns something. It returns the context. That means it returns the environment of where the inherited widget is being called. And whenever that context is being updated, the subtrees, the children in that tree, are going to be updated with the latest information. I don't want this behavior for this particular application. What I simply want to do is to make use of this one that just gets me the corresponding inherited widget and doesn't care about the context and changes to that inherited widget. So that was why inside our code I also said here that the inherited widgets should not update the children at any time. And the reason behind this is that in our application, the inherited widgets here, the provider widgets properties won't be changing in runtime. So it's just going to be fixed. So there won't be any need to update the children whenever the block property change, because I'm not going to be changing the block property inside this particular widget. It's just going to be fixed and final. So we don't need to update the sub-trees, and we don't need to get the context to check if this inherited widget has been updated. So that is why I'm actually using this ancestor inherited element for widget of exact type. So this is just the basic structure of creating a provider, and I believe I've broken it down to a reasonable level. But once we implement it, I'll still come back and explain what is currently happening. So we'll save this, and I think it's time to use it in our application. So the first place we're going to be using it would be, we could use it in the friend list app, but I'll be using it directly in the movie search app, the movie search widget I mean. So I'm going to head over to the movie search screen, and inside the movie search screen, I'm going to be wrapping every single thing with the provider widgets. So over here we have the block provider. Remember what I told you guys, we won't be accessing this inherited widget directly. We're going to be accessing it from the block provider. So over in my movie search app, I'm going to be wrapping everything with the block provider. So there are different ways of actually doing this, but I'm going to do it this way. Then later on I'll explain about other ways you can actually do this. So when we wrap, so I'm going to come over here and do wrap with a new widget, and I would say block provider, and the block provider needs what? It needs a child and it needs a block. So where am I going to be getting this block from? I'm going to be getting it from here. So there's something I'll quickly do. I would put this in an init method. So okay, so now we have this. So we have to provide the block, and I'm going to provide, remember the block provider is a generic class. So it is over here I would now state that I want it for the movie search block. So this block provider is of type movie search block. Then over here I would pass the block variable I initialized, I instantiated. So I'll say movie search block. So cool. So when we save, what this simply means is that this movie search block is rendering what is going to be rendering what an inherited widget. So if you come over here, you can see here it renders what an inherited widget. So let's head back up to this place. And I told you the advantage of inherited widgets is that we can actually access the properties which it's willing to share from subtrees. So this inherited widget over here, this provider is going to be sharing this block property. So now the previous way we were doing it was inside this custom app bar, we had to pass the block over here. But since we are making use of a provider, what do? We remove this, since we will not be passing it this way. Because like I explained, the custom app bar does not make use of that block. So while this, okay, it's loaded. So over here, I'm going to remove all this. This is the beauty of providers. You don't have to be passing stuff step by step. Then over here in my search box, I'm still going to remove this dependency now. So I would not be having the dependency during the creation of the search box. Instead, I'll be injecting that dependency. So I'm going to also remove this. Then inside the build method, I could now call the method we created previously. So let's say movie search. Should be equals to now block provider. Block provider should be of type what? Movie search block. And the reason why we are having this is, if you remember, everything here is generic. That's why we always have to specify the type of block. If we did not make it generic, we'll have to have a block provider for movie search and also have a separate block provider for friend list. So over here, you always have to specify the actual type. So I'm going to say block provider dot off, dot off, and it needs a context. So let's look at this signature one more time. So I'm calling the off method of the block provider. And if you come over here, the reason why we are doing that is because of the off method is static. You don't have to create a new instance of block provider to be able to call the off method. And remember, it takes in a parameter. It has a parameter of build context. So that is why we're doing what? We are passing the current context over here. So with inherited widgets, once you just invoke this, it is just immediately going to check its context and get the corresponding inherited widgets. So what this simply does is that we've now eliminated the dependency inside this search box class, and we are now injecting it over here inside the build method. So you can see this block now, we can call block.addQuery over here, and we did not have to pass it down from movie search to custom app bar down to search box. Instead, we injected the dependency directly over here. So I'm going to do a hot restart and see if this works. Then I'll come back and explain the block provider class once more. So I'll head over to movie search. Okay. So what is this saying? It's saying a build function returned null. The offending widget is block provider inherited base block. Okay, I'm returning base block over here. So when you see this type of error, the next thing to go would be to go check your block provider inherited class over here. So let's see. Okay, it extends base block. Okay. See, extends base block over here too. Am I missing something? Build functions must never return null. So that means over here, this block is currently returning null. So let me check. The block, the T I'm passing should extend. Am I missing something? Let me check the get type. I have block provider inherited of type C. Return the provider. Return new container. Okay, let me search something once more. I believe the problem is going to come from this. I'd have to put T extends block base, but let me confirm that first of all. Okay. I have to call. Okay, because the code looks correct. I have to call. I have to do this. I believe. Right? Okay, no. I'm doing something wrong. So I have the movie search block. I instantiated it on init. Then over here I'm calling the movie search. Okay, so let me do T extends But if I do t extend, when I'm using it here, okay, I don't think this is the solution, but it doesn't make extends base block. The build function returns null. So okay, t provider base block. Okay, no, it does not have to extend base block. I think one way I would use to debug this would be to see what this provider returns. So I'll just do a print statement. Let me see what the provider returns. So I pass in the type, yes. Okay. I think, no, it's not necessary. Okay. So let me see. Oops. Okay, so let's read the error now. The offending widget is block provider inherited base block. Build functions. The build function returned null. So I must be doing something. Block provider inherited base block. So what am I doing wrong here? So I have the final t block required this dot block widget child. Okay, so let me confirm something. Okay. Okay, I made a very silly mistake here in my inherited widget, because earlier on I said something about the inherited widget being responsible for creating the child, because over here we just initialize this block because we are the ones, this is the property the inherited widget is going to be sharing. Then as for the child property, it is going to be the responsibility of the inherited widget to probably to render that particular child. So that is why we are not creating a class member over here of child. We just passed in widget child over here. So the next thing I was supposed to do was to pass in this stuff into the super constructor. So the inherited widget would have the power to be able to create that particular child. So that's why the build function, the build method, was actually returning null. Okay, so you can see now it's no longer returning null. So you can see this block provider is now rendering this particular child. So we've solved one step of the problem. So you can see now by calling this child, passing the child property to the super constructor, the inherited widget can now have the power to do what? To create the child, which is this screen. So we've passed the first step. So the next step is this error. So it's saying here, no such method error getter widget was called on null. So I believe it should be from here, but let's read the error. And I think I just need to do a hot restart. Let me do a hot restart first of all. So whenever you change stuffs in your stateful widgets, you should always do a hot restart. So let's see if the problem was by just doing a hot restart. That'll be the solution. Okay, so it's not from there. Then the next thing would be to, let's see. Objects, no such method. Okay, so there's a problem with how I called with how I called this guy. So let me confirm. Okay. So I said static T, it's going to be returning this. Off should have this. So okay. So I believe the problem is with the way I declared this. So let me move this guy aside. So off is up would have a generic type of this, and that's what I'm doing over here. So I'm calling block provider that's off. So he said no such method. The getter widget was called on null. Tried calling widgets. So I still have my my print statement over here. So let's confirm the widget was called on null. I think I've experienced this stuff before. Let me read this. So sorry guys that I'm not gonna edit this stuff. You just be patient. Let's debug this stuff together. When the exception was thrown, this was the stack. Block provider of the getter widgets was called on null. The getter widget was called on null. That means this guy is returning null. So if that is not null, I should call the widget. So now it's not telling me the getter block was called on null. So it is, so we are calling block on null. So I could also say if provider is null, that's when I would be able to call block. The getter method add query. Okay, so there's a problem with this particular build contest. So instead of wasting our time, block.add query. Let me just check this one more time. Instead of wasting our time, I know this error would be a very simple thing, but instead of wasting our time, I think I'm going to pause this stuff, solve it, and come back and explain, because I've wasted time on this. So yeah, after taking a break, because sometimes in programming you just have to take a break and go through your code step by step. So after going through the code step by step, I noticed something over here. Over here in the stateful widget class, I made mention that this stateful widget over here is going to be extending the base block, and in this create states method over here, I did not also declare that this guy is going to be a generic type, because it has to match the same signature as the containing class, which is for this and also this. So this block provider state over here, you can see T extends base block. So for here, we're supposed to put that stuff, and for this we're also going to put the generic type T. And optionally in this static, it's optional, it's not a must, because once this extends base block, you're good to go. But you can also do T extends to make sure that you're passing the right block. But the major thing to note is that the signature always has to match. Whenever you're using creating a generic class, the signature has to match. So this T over here, this type also has to be the same thing over here to match the containing class, because you know a stateful widget, for it to be able to maintain the state of the class, it has to match the corresponding widget. So I'll save this and see. This should work, I believe. If it doesn't work, then I'll do a hot restart, because now the signature, okay, we have to do a hot restart. This is a stateful widget. So, and I also did a print statement here, so I'll bring out my debug console to check what the provider returns. So you can see, cool, it's no longer giving us an error just because of this simple stuff. So I had to take a break and just go through the code step by step to see if I've missed out anything. Then the next thing to do, can you see over here, it prints out the provider. So the provider, it prints out is what? Block provider inherited of type what? Movie search block. And the reason is that we are currently making use of the movie search block, which means that this text box, the parents inherited widget is what? The block provider of type movie search block. And we got that from over here. Over in the movie search.dat file, can you see? It prints out block provider with the movie search block. But remember what I told you about the block provider. The block provider renders an inherited widget as the child. So that is why you are seeing this private inherited widget of the type movie search block. So from this now, the first problem we solved is, I'm going to test this, this should work, but the first problem we solved from this is that we don't have to pass this property down to the custom app bar, down to the search box. We are directly injecting that dependency into this class, and this should work. So I should search for okay, it's going. This is the previous error. So we have it's currently working. So this is possible. We made this possible through by creating a block provider and injecting it in our search box, so we don't have to be passing properties step by step. We don't have to be passing properties step by step. So, oops, and I did not save this. Okay, let's see if we cached it. It did not cache it. So that's just the basic workflow of a block provider. So if I go over here once more and I do a brief overview, I told you guys that to make your widget access its parents without going step by step through the widget tree, we have to use something called an inherited widget. So the inherited widgets here, we have to specify the property we want to share with the subtrees, with the children. And over here we are sharing the block property, and it accepts what? The block and the child. I told you guys that the child, it's going to be the responsibility of the inherited widget to render the corresponding child over here. That is why we just passed it to the super constructor. Then for the stateful widget, the main reason we created the stateful widget was to make use of this dispose method over here. So over here now, we can now be able to close our controller whenever we unmount this particular provider. Then we created a static property called off, and this off is going to be responsible for getting the corresponding inherited widgets in our widget tree. So we used an inherited widget, so we won't have to be going step by step through the inherited the widget tree, because I told you that that is an O of n big O. But when we use inherited widgets, the big O complexity will be O of 1, which means it just goes from wherever we are calling it straight up to the inherited widget, so it's going to run faster. That is the simple explanation of what I did here. Then in the movie search app, we had to wrap our provider widgets with the entire app, so that whenever any widget belonging to this widget tree, any descendant of this widget tree would be able to access the inherited widget property through the off method, which is what we created over here. So you can see in the custom app bar over here, we made use of the off method here. So we said block provider.off, then we specified the type, and we got the corresponding block which the inherited widget shares with us. So that's just a basic workflow of this. So that is just the basic workflow of this. And in our friends block, I would not be in our friends list screen, I would not be making use of the provider widget, because we don't have a deeply nested tree. We are just using the block directly on this particular widget. So as a practice for you, I would want you guys to also implement this same thing I did in movie search screen. I want you guys to replicate it for the friend list app. So over here, you'd be wrapping the block provider widgets with your friend list block, and you can be able to access it wherever you want to access it. And I want you guys to try out to see if that works. And earlier on to try out to see if you guys have a good understanding of what you've watched so far. And earlier on in the video, I made mention of another way to actually achieve this stuff. Instead of creating a block provider, another way to actually achieve sharing the block instead of passing it through your widget tree would be to come over here in something like movie search block. You could create something called a singleton, which simply means a single instance. So you could create something like this movie search block and call it search block equals to movie. So you could create something like this, and what this simply means is that just one instance of this movie search block will be available in your application. So instead of you coming to create providers or instantiating this block inside your stateful widgets, you can just directly import this file and make use of this variable directly. So the advantage of that, using this singleton approach, would be that you don't have to always create providers. You just have one instance of this block running in your entire application. But one thing you have to note while using this is that in your main widgets, you should make it in your home widget, you should make it a stateful widget and call the dispose method of that particular block, so that whenever you close your application, that blocks instance is being the controller is being closed. That means the dispose method is being closed and the corresponding controller would be closed. So that is another way of achieving shared states. And the final thing I want us to note for our screens over here is that when you make use of the provider, now you don't need this dispose method anymore. You would not be needing this dispose method, because if you can see in the provider over here, in the stateful widgets, we say the widgets block should call what? Dispose method. So we won't be there won't be need to call it in our individual screens. So to show that this actually works, what we're going to be doing would be to come over here, and I'll just do a simple print statement disposing what movie search block. So to show you that it's actually calling it whenever that's components on mounts. So I'm going to do a hot restart. This is the final thing. So I'll bring up my debug console and I want you guys to see. So if I come here, I don't necessarily have to search. I can just go back and you can see disposing movie search block was executed. I don't have to manually call it in our screens. Our provider handles all those stuffs for us, and that is possible because of what the stateful widgets which we implemented over here. So that'll be it for this video. I hope you guys have an understanding of what we did in this video, although I'm sorry for that error or that time I wasted trying to figure out that stuff. But that's how programming is, and sorry I don't edit my videos, but that's how it's going to be. So in the next video, in the next part of this series, we're going to be talking about something called RxDart, which is Dart's implementation of Reactive X programming approach. So that's what we're going to be covering in the next part. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.